Welcome to episode 252 of the All the Books Show, the official podcast of the David A. Howe Public Library. We talk book news, author news, and literary news. I'm Eric Mickles.
I'm Nick Gunning. And a little later in the episode, we're going to have a special guest. Niki Gordon is back. Niki was last on when we were doing the social distancing episodes, interviewing different people. Yeah. She was on with the whole staff. Niki's a big fantasy fan, and so we needed her help for today because, Eric, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about Matchbox 20's debut album.
I did the wrong research. No,
we're talking about fantasy alternatives.
That's right. If you read the big ones, here are some of the other ones that you might want to check out. Boy, you know what? I also feel like we should hit some of the sad news right up front. Comic book legend Denny O'Neil has passed away. And last week, we were talking about one of his creations, the Green Lantern, John Stewart.
A whole spotlight on John Stewart,
We certainly did, and we'd recorded prior to the news coming out, so we just wanted to address it right up front today. I mean, I'm a Denny O'Neil fan.
Very sad.
Going back a long ways. I was really sad to hear this news because he's written some of my absolute favorite stories. We've featured his work on this podcast many, many times. Do you have a favorite Denny O'Neil story, Eric?
Tales of the Demon, I think, might have been the first one I read of him. That was his introduction of Ra's al Ghul.
Yeah.
He spent so much time as well being like an editor at both Marvel and DC that like he put Frank Miller on Daredevil.
Yep.
So it's, I love that run of Daredevil, and that is due to Dennis O'Neil putting him on there and giving. And also he was like overseer of the Batman titles for so long. And oversaw a lot of No Man's Land, and because he had the foresight of that. And I love No Man's Land is one of my favorite Batman stories. And who knows if he hadn't, saw that.
Well, I mean, like just now. Getting back to a serious Batman, I think a lot of credit goes to Denny O'Neil and Steve Englehart for making that happen. But we feature. I mean, for me, when we did our Superman spotlight, he wrote one of my all-time favorite Superman stories, Superman Kryptonite No More. This was where Superman's powers, Golden and Silver Age Superman powers were basically he can just do anything in the world. Like, you want him to juggle planets, he can do it. And Denny O'Neil was one who was like, this character needs to be grounded a little bit more. And his Kryptonite No More story really put Superman's powers in a realm of, like, what was possible and able to use stories that were a little bit more realistic because of that. And it's just a wonderful story. And that's collected in a nice hardcover. In our Wonder Woman episode... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say, he wrote the Wonder Woman series that at the time was very controversial I don't think really well liked because a lot of people saw him as like depowering the major female superhero. And like I remember watching a documentary where he's like, and now I totally get it. Yeah. I totally see where they're coming from. I know you like the series just for the story.
I do. The thing is, so it's collected in 4 volumes called Diana Prince Wonder Woman. And in those, Wonder Woman is tired of the ties with Steve Trevor. She's tired of like Paradise Island ruling her life. And finally, she's just like, look, I don't need this to do good. And so she walks away, steps aside from Paradise Island, gives away all of her like Amazonian strength, and just becomes a secret agent, and is going around like doing good just in a mortal form. And the problem at the time was that Wonder Woman was really the only female superhero
with her own title and at that power level, who was like could go toe to toe with Superman. I mean, this was before then, like, even Ms. Marvel was, like, on the scene in a big way?
Yeah.
So,
and the thing was, like, now we have the hindsight to look back and say this was just a temporary little trip in Wonder Woman's thing. It was, it was an
but, like, in the 70s, this has only been for, like, 20 years that, like, or even maybe, like, 15 years that, like, comic continuity felt like a thing.
Because it's not just 5 issues or something. It is a long stretch where Wonder Woman is depowered. Yeah. So certainly in the 70s, you would understand why people would rightly be upset for the only female superhero of that stature to lose her powers. For me, I liked what he did with it, and I liked how he made it so like her strength doesn't come from just having like this Amazonian skill. Like, she is a strong character because of who she is. And he took that and really told some great Wonder Woman stories for that time. I wouldn't want Wonder Woman to stay depowered like that forever, but going back and reading those stories was a lot of fun just to see her do a completely different thing. So I loved that. And of course, the creation of John Stewart hugely important, and his run on Green Arrow, Green Lantern really, I don't know, grounded comics and made them a lot more of a serious thing for people to read and learn from. So, Denny O'Neil, I think, has left his mark on all comics because, as you said, I mean, he was editor for a long time and has a lot of influence in both DC and Marvel. So the comics that we have today, I think we owe a lot to Denny O'Neil, who was just a great writer as well. I think he had the insights to shape those characters on a grander scale and the skill to write them, story by story. Yeah. And I've read several of his novels as well. It's just
he created Ironmonger, the Obadiah Stane in the Iron Man universe. And, that's actually a really the Ironmonger trade paperback by Dennis O'Neil is a really good Iron Man story. I think it might have been the first Iron Man comic that I read of that era, and where I started going in terms of where do I start to read Iron Man trade paperback wise, to lead up to all the Matt Fraction stuff and everything. I think that was it. Yeah. And it was still really good. And he was definitely somebody who wanted to get his own moral point of views across, and you could tell that by reading his Question. The Question series. Yep. You can definitely read it he was definitely inspired by Alan Moore's Swamp Thing in terms of just the darkness of it all. But he's definitely putting a lot of his stuff in there. And then, Green Arrow, Green Lantern. I mean, that was basically so he could, discuss the problems he sees. And like you say, when we did the John Stewart one issue, they're dealing with things in outer space. But then on the other issue, they're dealing with, racial tensions and drug use and if one issue had Kid Flash, he's I found a gun in the medicine cabinet. You wouldn't be too surprised because he was just trying to get these things across. Yeah, I don't know how much we talk about it on here, but Kevin Smith's podcast, Fat Man on Batman, back when he used to really focus on Batman and he would interview writers, he interviewed Dennis O'Neil, and it was a 3-part interview, and it was just fascinating.
It really was.
I could have just listened to, because Dennis O'Neil, listening to Dennis O'Neil talk about his own stuff, but also just how much of comic book history and Batman history he was involved with, and it's just gosh, it you just wanted to hear about it all. And then what happened? Yeah, it's just
one of the all-time most important, most influential comic book writers and editors that has ever been and ever will be. Honestly,
David A. Howe Library has Birth of the Demon.
Yep.
But that two of the stories are by Mike Barr, but he also wrote Dennis O'Neil has Birth of a Demon in there. Wrote it in 1992. So that's a collection of Ra's al Ghul stories. So that's there as well.
If you haven't read Denny O'Neil's stuff, we have a lot in the collection, and we can certainly get you whatever you need. But I particularly recommend Superman Kryptonite No More, and his Batman stuff I think is excellent.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, too, that he wrote, basically really important stories / runs for the trinity of DC superheroes.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much every marquee character he's worked with at some point. So anyway, thanks for the good times. All right, let's open up the old book, see where the bookmarks are. That's a new thing that you're doing.
That's a book that you're opening that didn't get a lot of sleep last night.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit tired. Yeah. It's a yawning bookmark.
Yeah. Okay. I finished a few things that I'll tell you about. I finished Devil's Heart by Carmen Carter. That's the next-gen book that I was reading for a book club. It was a lot of fun. Read by Gates McFadden.
Even the devil has a heart.
I mentioned. Yeah. Read by Gates McFadden, and she did a good job doing impersonations of the other next-gen cast, so I had a good time with that.
Gates
McFadden, yes. I read Cyborg Volume 1 Unplugged for the New 52 run of the character. Probably the best Cyborg that I've read so far. I'm currently reading still The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. This is the Hunger Games prequel.
It is.
For the YA for Adults book club, Kate and I are reading Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. Not too far in it so far, but I'm digging that. And I picked up Iron Man: The Enemy Within by Denny O'Neil because I haven't read his Marvel stuff. So this is my first of his Marvel run. Begins at issue 158 and goes for a good long stretch. So I'm reading the first collection of his, The Enemy Within.
I only read I don't know how much more of his Iron Man I read, because like I just read the volume that was just Ironmonger. I don't even think the Epic collections were out at the time.
Yeah.
And it was like 2012 when I was reading it.
Okay.
So I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid.
Like you finished it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. What did you think?
First, after I finished it, I'm like, do I want to give this 3 or 4 stars? Mm-hmm. And then I couldn't sleep because I couldn't think of how many stars to give it. I'm like, wow, this is stupid. Who the heck cares how many stars I give this book on Goodreads?
Where'd it land?
I know you do, but I gave it 4 stars. I think I gave it a generous 4 stars. Like, I kept reading it. I couldn't put it down. It was a very easy read and very convincing, so much for at the time that sometimes I forgot I was reading like a fiction book.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. I found there's 2 main characters you can think of. There's Billy and there's Daisy Jones.
Yeah.
And I found Billy to be an insufferable control freak and Daisy Jones to be hot trash. And it's hard to read a book when those are the 2 main characters. It's hard to I don't like either of these 2 characters. And I think I was supposed to like them and see the good in them more. But I found them obnoxious even on their good parts, because I'm like, well, I don't know. The drummer, I tell you what, the drummer cracked me up. Warren?
Yeah.
Is his name? Every time he says something, they're like, she was screaming, and he's like, he was wrong, and then Warren's like, I was outside.
Yeah.
It's just so...
We should say, if you're not familiar with this book, it's not written in a traditional narrative way. It's all written as if it's just collected interviews of the people
over time
in this band of the Six, and what happens when they add Daisy Jones into the mix. See, I waffled between 4 and 5, and there's a plot point that I thought just weakened it, but it's a big spoiler, so we can talk about it off mic. But
we talk about at the end.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't. That twist at the end, I'm like, oh,
yeah.
Twist. I guess it's not a twist.
Right. No, it's not a twist, but it is a direction that I wish they would have avoided. And that for me was like, no, that cheapens it. I don't
I felt the resolution was a little too... The end stuff just didn't really work with me. And here's the thing. There was just something about these 2 characters that...
Listen, I think maybe you made a mistake. I think maybe you 3-starred this book.
No, because I couldn't put it... It did feel exactly like I was reading, real history.
Yeah, it did.
But I guess I just felt like the characters... And not just Billy and Daisy, but I felt like everyone was one-dimensional. This is my view on rock and roll and being in a band, and that is my view. And there was very little, but I guess my problem is it's Daisy and Billy are the main characters. I didn't like them. I was more interested in the other stuff, like Graham and the keyboardist.
I don't think I really read it like that. I don't think I really read it thinking these are the main characters. The way that she puts it together really makes the whole thing feel like an ensemble. And it's like,
oh my word,
you're reading about a house of cards. You know what I mean? And anything can make this fall. That was where I feel like the tension really was.
I guess I could have used a little bit more of that drama. Okay, maybe you're right. I should have, but I felt like I had to give it 4 stars because I was up till 4 a.m. last night finishing it.
Yep.
And, it's coming as a limited series, and I think it might be stronger that way. Do you want to listen to Aurora, the album that they make?
I do, yeah. I mean, when I read this, it was it's just like in Finders Keepers, Stephen King's Finders Keepers, which was all about this series of books. I was desperate to read those books, and I felt the same way about the album here in Daisy Jones and the Six. I mean, she just sold it in a way that I was like, I have to hear this. So
I think I am going. I think it might be Hulu that's putting out this mini series. It's hard because do they do this show like they did this book where it's an interview? It's a look back. Do they?
Yeah. I think
if they do
have to.
I'm hoping that they put out the album, but it would be hard then too because no way the album is going to be as good as the book tells us it's going to be.
That's true. The book is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which we do have in our collection and on Overdrive, so check it out.
I got it on Overdrive. Yeah, nice. It came pretty fast. I returned it, so if you're in the David A. Howe public area,
it's available.
And we talked about this with our new classics episode a couple of episodes back because Nick's right. I mean, it's timeless. It takes place in the 70s, but it's a look back thing. Yeah. So in 10 years, the 70s aren't going to have changed how they were dealing with drugs and sex and all that. So,
yep. Well, I think we got to get right to it. We've got a big old spotlight locked and loaded.
Yeah, let's talk about some fantasy books that are pretty great alternatives to other fantasy books that are always being suggested.
All right, let's get into it.
today we are talking about fantasy books, but maybe fantasy books that you haven't read, or maybe fantasy books that you thought about reading but you haven't picked up. Basically, if you grew up reading certain fantasy books in school or on your own, and you're looking for places to go after the big popular children fantasy books that are out there, we're suggesting we've got some younger fantasy books for kids and teens, and then we've also got some adult. Though I'm also not going to be super useful coming up with fantasy books that are like being in a wizard school or something, because I didn't really read more about that as I grew up, as I went on. But Nick and I are also joined by Niki Gordon from the David A. Howe Public Library.
Niki, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
The last time Niki was here, Eric, we talked about how it was amazing that it took like hundreds of episodes before she got on the podcast, and she was like, "Well, maybe it'll be another couple years before I have to come back." But nope.
Yeah.
No, of course not.
As soon as you got out there, as soon as you got on mic, Niki.
I know. And you're going to roll me in.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, Niki, how could we talk fantasy and not get you on the show? Fantasy is your genre, right?
Well, yeah, I like fantasy. I do.
All right. Can you take us back to the early days then? What fantasy series got you hooked as a kid?
Well, first, I think it was the films, the animated films.
Okay.
I watched as a very young girl, The Last Unicorn, The Hobbit, Pete's Dragon.
Okay.
I was just fascinated by all those. You know, I read The Hobbit around 11, and I think after that, the first fantasy novel that I read was Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was really cool because it just had like this evil, dark wizard in his book. I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen King, but Flag is the evil wizard in that. He shows up in a lot of his other books.
Dark Tower
the Dark
stuff?
Tower
Yeah,
series.
okay.
He's in the Stand, and he's just an evil dude.
Okay. Did you ever
Kinda
watch The Black Cauldron? You remember that Disney movie, The Black? I've never seen that. Is it good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I liked it.
And that's based on a whole novel series as well. And I remember, like, for a long time, The Black Cauldron was like the Disney movie that we must not speak of because it was too like grown up, I think was the argument against it.
Yeah, I watched it right after college, mainly out of curiosity because the school's library had Black Cauldron. So I was like, let's do this. Let's see what it's all about. And it is a weird mix of like Disney sensibilities with like Don Bluth animated sensibilities.
Yeah.
And I can see why it has its fans, but also why it's left some people unsatisfied.
Okay.
It goes for it in a lot of stuff, but then there's some stuff you can't shake the Disney-ness off of it. It's really an interesting thing. I don't think Disney should be like as ashamed of it as they are. I think they should definitely, if you're showing off The Great Mouse Detective, you should also include Black Cauldron.
That's true.
But I guess it was like PG, right?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
An 80s Disney film that was rated PG, so...
I was not allowed to watch it as a child, like, for those reasons. It was very, like... The whole, like, any kind of, like, magic or witchcraft was a big no-no when I was a kid.
Yeah. But the villain is, like, this cloaked goat man skeleton monster.
Okay. All right. It's based on the second book in the Chronicles of Pridden series by Lloyd Alexander, and actually was a Newbery Honor book when it came out back in 1966.
Yeah, I don't know how many fans of the book are fans of the movie.
Yeah, I'd be interested
but
to
I
know
think
that
people
too.
who've seen the movie apart from the books tend to think it's really an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, while we're talking old school Disney with witch vibes, I love Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Also based on a book series.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. All right, so Niki, you think it was the animated stuff that got you interested in that world?
Yeah, I used to watch it over and over again when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. That really got me, I think, hooked. You know, I was kind of a quiet, introverted kid, so I liked the escapism of fantasy.
Really, you were quiet as a kid. I wouldn't have guessed that at all. So that's what a shock.
Yes, really, right?
What a shock. Did the Hobbit?
So now that...
Okay. Did The Hobbit lead you right into like Lord of the Rings and that sort of thing? Did you get into Tolkien's other stuff?
Yeah, I read that in high school.
Okay.
Loved it, of course, yeah. And then after that, I think in high school, I also got into Anne Rice and her Vampire Chronicles.
Oh, yeah.
I just liked how different that was than your normal vampire. Well, her writing style is very descriptive and kind of poetic, and I like her use of Lestat, the vampire Lestat, favorite.
See, I think this is why I haven't read a lot of fantasy, is because like the time when it would have hooked me was when I was not allowed to do any of that sort of thing. Like I wasn't allowed to watch He-Man, I wasn't allowed to watch Bewitched. I mean, if there was a magical element, it was like I've never seen The Never-Ending Story. Like all of that stuff was just off the table.
I had like
for me.
zero parental supervision as a kid, so
What about you, Eric? What are your early days?
When it comes to reading, I usually talk a big game when it comes to sci-fi, even though I haven't really read a lot of sci-fi. But when it comes to fantasy,
Poser.
I have a hard time thinking what I read prior to like the first Harry Potter book. And then I got into Everworld, and I really didn't read a lot of fantasy. Like I started reading fantasy, it was one summer, I think it would be like 2009, the summer of 2009. I read The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss and Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. And like reading those two books in like back to back kind of opened my eyes to what modern fantasy was. Because I had read Hobbit and the first two Lord of the Rings books in high school, right before Lord of the Rings came out in theaters. And like I found them a little bit dry and didn't really connect and everything. But when I read Name of the Wind and Neverwhere, I'm like, oh, the fantasy genre does a lot of different stuff than, just the big epic fantasy. So book-wise, those were the big things. I don't think I was too into fantasy even as a kid. I mean, Animorphs, I always talk about being like kind of this soft gateway into science fiction for me as a kid, and probably which also led me to like comic book mentality and stuff. So I mean, I watched movies and stuff, but I just could never really connect with fantasy too much as a kid. But I remember I read the first Harry Potter book because the cover and the description reminded me of the DOS game Hocus Pocus, which we had like a shareware of on our computer. So I have to go into DOS and play it. But like I was like, oh, Hocus Pocus is a boy wizard, and I think he might be in a school. So, like, that led me to that. So, like, I didn't watch any of those. I think I watched, like, Never-Ending Story as a kid, and it really kind of freaked me out a bit. But not too many fantasy movies either. The biggest, like, fantasy animated movie I watched as a kid would be Secrets of NIMH was the movie.
Yeah.
But even that's a bit more sci-fi in some ways because of how the rats are, like, been done with experiments. So it's only in the past, at this point, like a decade or so, the past decade that I've really been reading fantasy.
The Name of the Wind is one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
It's a good one to start with if you want to jump into fantasy, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember why I picked it up. I really don't. There was a bookstore where I lived at the summer that had a lot of they did staff picks, and there was one guy there who I don't think I ever met him, but like all his picks were always so cool. There was a lot of sci-fi ones, but I remember The Name of the Wind was on there as well.
I know. I mean, Eric, I know I've heard you talking about these series many times, but I still don't know what those books are about.
Name of the Wind. I mean, if you're gonna give somebody like, oh, I read Harry Potter. I want something that's a bit more adult. I mean, Name of the Wind is actually a pretty smooth gateway there because while the openings of and it's a long book, while a lot of the beginning is more him with this like traveling minstrels and his family and like learning how to do a certain type of magic in the book series. About midway, he starts going to this school that teaches the magic that's in the books. And it kind of becomes, what if Harry Potter was written for adults in some ways? So that's a pretty smooth transition. Nikki, it's been forever since I've read Name of the Wind. Yeah,
it is more of an adult book. The magic is more complex, and you have to be really, really smart to get a handle of it. And the main character, Quoth, is like this witty, really intelligent character, but he seems perfect on the outside, but he's actually pretty flawed. And
you meet him when he's pretty young too. He's like a kid for a lot of the book, and I think even by the second book, he's still only like 17.
Yeah, it's a good storyline, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And it's not finished yet. He hasn't come out with the third.
Yeah, no, I've just finished recently Wise Man's Fear, and I was kind of complaining that it's been like 10 years since he wrote the second book.
I'm going to have to go back and reread them because...
the magic in The Name of the Wind is sympathy. right? It's where like you have to connect certain things. So if a bird's flying in the sky and you want to get it to fall out of the sky, you might use your sympathy magic to connect it with some oil so that the bird's wings are now coated and it can't fly.
Oh, that is interesting.
And so it is an interesting magic. I've been being like really impressed with it. I think it's a type of like alchemy.
Exactly. Yep.
And that's the school that he goes to. For most of the Name of the Wind is at that school.
Yeah. Yeah, it's him growing up in the school, and then in the second book is more him outside school and in the real world.
Yeah. It's more for adults because it's not just about him going to this school, but it's also about him trying to afford going to school.
Yeah.
He's like, I got to get a job and pay for school.
One thing I liked about it was the musical aspect of it. Was really he's a really talented musician.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he plays lute. Yes.
Yeah. A lute.
And it's like his most prized possession in the world. Yeah. Like, if you were to take his lute and smash it, he'd kill you dead.
Yeah.
So, you know what? Right before Name of the Wind, when I was just starting college, I ended up picking up American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Oh, yeah.
I picked that up because I was a fan of Sandman and some of his other comic book work. And so I was like, yeah, okay, let's try this. I was looking for something that was like his Sandman book, and American Gods but it's a very weird book at times, and so I think it kind of put me off a little bit, even though like it's a good book. It has a lot of really interesting ideas. I think like a lot of the ideas were really like out there in some ways, and so I wasn't quite ready to jump in. You know what, too, Nick? We've talked about this on the podcast. Right before that, I read Kilney McGregor's Knights of Darkness, The Lords of Avalon, book 2.
Yeah.
Because I thought the cover looked cool, because it was just that handsome Aragorn-looking figure with a sword. But as it turned out, it was a very steamy romance book, and I picked up the cover switcheroo. In a bookstore. This was right as I was getting back into reading, and this book was just on display at Barnes and Noble. And I was like, cool, he's like the son of Lancelot and Morgan Le Fay. That sounds cool. Let's try this out. And then it's like, oh no, this is a very hot romance novel. And I read the whole thing, but it wasn't what I was looking for.
Yeah.
So
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
I love that.
But what?
I think you got to finish the series now. I mean, you started it. You know what I mean?
I started at book 2.
I think I got to see it through.
But you know what? That book, American Gods, and Neverwhere, which is the book that I read like right after Name of the Wind, they're all urban fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I really like understood what urban fantasy was until I read Neverwhere. And then I kind of understood it and realized like fantasy had all these different genres as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really loved Neverwhere.
Neverwhere was much more what I was looking for when I was like, I want something that's like like Sandman, and I loved Neverwhere. That was one of my favorites, and one I kept like recommending to people.
Very visual, very descriptive, imaginative. American Gods was a hard to read. It felt very masculine to me, and I found parts of it hard for me to read. But it was cool. It did have really good concept. I did like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Neverwhere is the one I always suggest because it seems like an easier transition. It's kind of a cool world. Like it's in this like other world, but it's a little bit also underground. It's like underneath London, but it's also not directly underneath London. Like you can't just go down to the subways and find it, but it is in like a old abandoned subway kind of setting. It's it's interesting, and the main character is likable, and it's got a lot of like really fun characters.
Slapstick humor too.
Yeah.
The Neil Gaiman Spotlight we did back in episode 51 is one of our most popular episodes of all time. People always go back to listen to that.
Was that you and me, or was that you, me?
That was you, me, and Ben Lehman. Yep, who does our music for the show. Yeah. You're making me think of Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. You guys read those?
No, it's on my list. I've always wanted to.
I've read half of it. I think we talked about it. I was reading half of it, but then I was in a really bad place emotionally and physically at the time. And so like I was just in a bad location, and like a lot of drama was going on. I mean, basically I had to go to a friend's wedding, but at that wedding, one of the bridesmaids was my ex-girlfriend, had broken up with me a month before then. Yeah. And so I had to drive hours and hours alone to get there, and they wanted me to film it, so I had to stay. Jeez. And at that time, I was reading the first Dresden book, and I was just like, you know what?
Yep.
I can't do it, and I've never been able to go back.
Yeah. So, it's funny how that happens.
Weren't we reading it together?
Well, you bought it for me. The reason why I've read it is because you bought it for me. And you wrote in the cover, this is a gift, you have to read it. And so I did. And I wasn't really expecting to like it because I don't read a ton of that kind of stuff. But I actually really did. I thought it was a really good balance of...
Didn't the cover compare it to like Something Meets the Rockford Files?
It did, yeah. I think it was Harry Potter. I think it was Harry Potter meets the Rockford Files.
Harry Potter meets the Rockford Files.
Yeah.
I was like, so, well, there you go, Nick.
Perfect. But I did. I really enjoyed that first book, and I always intended to go back and read more, but you never bought me anymore, and I never picked up anymore. Right, yeah. So for more on the Rockford Files, go back to our John Davey interview where we talk about his time working on the Rockford Files. But yes, the Jim Butcher novels are really popular in our library, and he has a newer series too about... I don't even know what it's about, but it's something in the sky. But what I read,
I remember reading the first half and like liking it. It's definitely like, what if all the fantasy stuff that you connotate with fantasy, basically like, what if Dungeons & Dragons was real, but hidden in the real world, and there was a detective who just dealt with it.
Well, what was kind of nice for me as like a novice in that genre was that I feel like Dresden as a character is also kind of aware that the stuff happening is unusual for the common man. Yeah. You know, he's like having a conversation with a skull on his desk, and he's just sort of like almost acknowledging the fact that like, so this is weird, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good entry point for that, for someone like me who, you know, is not big into the genre. But I had a good time with Dresden Files.
It really is. Outside of Name of the Wind, Neverwhere, and The Gunslinger, and American Gods, and Dresden... Like I seemed like I was kind of stuck in this urban fantasy world. I think maybe like even though I was reading some fantasy, I was still kind of scared about getting into like high fantasy or epic fantasy. Sci-fi was easy for me. It's like, oh, it's the real world, but in the future, or you know, all this other stuff. Like that was easy for me to connect to. But like maybe it was after I read Dune that I was like, okay, not all sci-fi is, you know, real world and stuff. And you know, free of make-believe. I think with, like, fantasy, I was always kind of worried about, like, oh, but, you know, they just have to make up everything. You go into a fantasy world, and you're basically blind going in for so long, because it's this whole new... You have to learn everything all over again. So, yeah, I think for a while, I just felt like, you know, having read Everworld and Harry Potter as a kid, it just made urban fantasy the kind of, like, go-to for a while. So...
Nikki, what else do you have high on your list? What are some of your other favorite series?
The Dark Tower series was another one of my all-time favorites.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
It's like the other books, like The Gunslinger is really in that world, but is it the other books in the series that's kind of bounce back between worlds more?
Yeah, the Gunslinger kind of starts it off. Then there's the other books are just it's in Midworld, and it jumps back and forth between our world and Midworld, and each one kind of has its own unique journey with it. But it's like a dark fantasy, horror, and western all rolled up into one. And it's just I just really love Roland, that main character, and you really get invested in this journey and his obsession to find the Dark Tower.
Right. Did you read all 7, or is it 8?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I like the basic, like he wrote like half the series, but he was taking too long or something. And then after he got hit by the car is what kind of inspired him to finish.
Finish it, yeah.
Yeah, he said he was like at a convention or something, and he heard somebody saying, or he read online that like, that's it, we're never getting the rest of the Dark Tower. And it kind of spurred Stephen King to be like, oh, I guess I better finish this before another car hits me.
Yeah.
See, I've always been interested in the Dark Tower, but my experiences to it are pretty limited. Like, I have read The Gunslinger, but I didn't go into it with the right expectations. Like, I just didn't realize just how much of a fantasy it was. And that one is, in particular, it feels like borrows a lot more from like a spaghetti western almost than, like you said, Nikki, it has that western vibe. But I feel like that first one, you can just see Clint Eastwood, you know, the man with no name, Clint Eastwood's character in that role. So, I mean, I've read that. I watched the Idris Elba movie. Did you like the movie, Nikki?
Not as much.
Yeah, it seems like nobody really likes it.
I don't think
The place...
Bold question, Nick.
I know. Well, you never know. The place where I was the most intrigued by the Dark Tower, like, stuff, was probably the book Hearts in Atlantis. Have you read that one, Nikki?
No.
Okay. It is really a collection of novellas, and so Hearts in Atlantis is probably the most prominent one because the movie with Anthony Hopkins was made. But in the movie, cuts out really any reference to the Dark Tower and everything that's going on within that world. But the book is a lot more about that character sort of keeping the younger kid away from that. And I found that really intriguing, and that actually made me want to go back and read a little bit more of the books. But what about it specifically? What about the Dark Tower do you think? Because I think Stephen King considers that like his magnum opus. I mean, for him, I think that's it. What do you think? What are the strengths of that series, Nikki?
Basically, the characters. It's just character driven, and each book is different, but each character is heroic in their own way, and their backstories and how they relate to the journey in general just is really intriguing. It gets you really immersed into their stories, and you get really kind of tied to the characters because they just become so much part of the story. That's what for me anyway.
Okay.
King, in my opinion, he has a real talent for creating these memorable characters that just kind of grab a hold of you. So,
although those characters were not present in the Institute, I can tell you that. Eric and I had a bad time. Bad time reading the Institute. That one. Yeah, that's fine. That's very skippable. One of what I should mention, one of the ones that when I was a kid that really like took my imagination was Return to Oz. Have you guys seen Return to Oz?
The movie? No.
Yes, that is it's a freaky movie. Let me tell you what. Why I was allowed to watch
lady from,
Return to Oz and not like Neverending Story, I will never know, because Return to Oz is a 2-hour fever dream. Where
what's her name? The girl from
it's Fairuza Balk.
Island of Dr. Moreau. Fairuza Balk is Dorothy
in that. Yeah. So I would say The Wizard of Oz actually was. I don't know why. Again, I don't know why I was allowed. There's good and bad witches in that. I mean, there's lots of witchiness in The Wizard of Oz. But both of those movies, the classic like Judy Garland and that '80s movie, the '80s movie terrified me. But I've read all of Baum's Wizard of Oz books, and I'm kind of surprised that those never really had much of a resurgence. I mean, I don't think Wizard of Oz has ever really sort of gone out of the public consciousness. And with Wicked and that sort of thing, kind of bringing it back, decades ago. But those books, I don't think have ever really seen like a big fancy re-release and having new generations discover it. Oh. And I think that's kind of unfortunate because those are pretty heavy fantasy. Like as you get going, there's some, I don't know, unexpected things happen. Some super dark things happen in there. And it becomes a really intriguing series. And the movie is very far removed from what the books are actually about. So that would be one that I would say. I mean, I liked those as a kid, and I've probably read 15 of those or something. I love them. Right. Have you read them?
No.
Nikki? Okay, no. Okay.
But I love The Wizard of Oz, so I'm writing that down. I'm going to check it out. But although I did not like Wicked, I read Wicked and I didn't like it.
I was familiar with the Baum books, and even some of there's I want to say there's 48 of those official Wizard of Oz books. After Baum stopped writing them, different authors would take over, still as part of like the official Baum estate. But I was familiar with those. I've tried to read Wicked several times and just could never get into it. I've picked it up and been like, this is the time. Nope, I don't think so. So I don't think it's in the cards for me. You weren't a fan of that though, Nikki, right?
No, I took it on vacation with me, and I just kept kind of dozing off every time I tried to read it. I just couldn't get into it.
All right. What else you got in the tank, Eric? What are some of the other series that your go-to?
What really kind of like started this like snowball effect of reading more fantasy and fantasy titles was listening to the podcast Writing Excuses, of which Brandon Sanderson kind of, I mean, when I was listening to it, it felt like he was kind of like the showrunner of it. But like listening to them, I was like, all right, I'm going to read stuff by this. That's how I read Dan Wells' I'm Not a Serial Killer. And I picked up Brandon Sanderson's Elantris off of that. And that was, after all the other like urban fantasy I've read, Elantris was like full fantasy. And like Brandon Sanderson's pretty famous for being a world builder and definitely like a magic system person. Like his magic has a system. He works it down to a science. And so like it was my first time like experiencing that while reading Elantris. And at the time I read it, it was a standalone, but it was also kind of short. So it felt very like entry level friendly into this like high fantasy, of which it was. Like, it's a big fantasy world. It goes back and forth between these three characters, not first person, but in third person. But each chapter is focusing on one of the characters. And, I've had less success recommending it to people. Like, some people have picked it up and not really gotten into it, which kind of discouraged me a bit. But I still really liked it and thought it was a good entry point. But I've seen less success doing that. But I don't know. The Mistborn series is one that I thought got better as it went on.
Okay.
Those are 3 books. Still pretty long books, but, not like Wheel of Time or Game of Thrones, all that length. But they're also, world built from scratch, a magic system that's down to a science. It was really kind of cool, kind of like subverting the, what if the hero of legend, what if the one who like the prophecy spoke of turned out to be the villain? Mm-hmm. What if he did the quest and it turned out now he's a bad guy?
Oh,
and so like the first book is basically about them trying to take him down. And then the rest of the series kind of follows the repercussions of that. What did the prophecy really mean and all that stuff? So it's kind of like, what if Aragorn had turned out to be the villain in a lot of ways?
Right.
When teens would come in and were asking for something because they either read like Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson or they wanted something a bit more adult than the Rick Riordan YA fantasy, I think I did kind of start suggesting Mistborn because it's still, she's a younger character, Vin, and it did kind of feel like a pretty good leap from like YA fantasy into Mistborn. And I think some libraries even shelve it.
Yeah.
Like even start putting it in YA. It's kind of like those cross-generational things. So, I don't know. Maybe Mistborn is the one I should have been suggesting to people over Elantris.
Okay.
He's definitely...
his books overwhelm me.
Yes, that's true. His books have gotten bigger and bigger. His The Way of Kings series, the Stormlight Archive books, I mean, forget about it. I only read them on my Kindle because I'm not holding a book that big in my hands for however long it would take to read.
Yeah.
And then they put them in paperback. Like, that's supposed to solve anything. It's falling apart like an 800-year-old book in your hands. The spine can't take it. You're just constantly gluing it.
You mentioned Wheel of Time a minute ago. How I read the Wheel of Time, I want to say the first 2 books even. They were paperbacks that were split in half. It was like, what's the first one called? What is the first Wheel of Time book?
Eye of the World.
Eye of the World. Yeah.
So you had Eye of the World Part 1 and Part 2?
I think they had their own little names, but the subtitle was Eye of the World Part 1.
Dune did that as well, and makes it very confusing when you're trying to read just Dune.
Yeah.
It's like Dune separated into 3 books because it was so massive as well. And now I think we're a little bit more friendly. Did you start reading Wheel of Time when I started reading it? Because I started reading it when I was in college.
Yes, I did. Well, my wife is a big fan. She's always loved those series and was really excited when Brandon Sanderson picked up the series to finish it. So, I think around that same time I started. I've actually read the first 2 of that series, and I know we talked about this a little on our...
It's funny because your wife is the big fan, but like when I started reading them, both you and my wife got into them. So you and Kendra were reading them at the same time, and you both kind of just stopped at the same point. Neither one of you got past The Great Hunt.
Yeah. No, that's true. I finished The Great Hunt. I read the first 2
books. I don't think Kendra finished The Great Hunt.
Yeah.
So you've read more of The Wheel of Time than Kendra now.
And looking back, I mean, I really enjoyed Eye of the World. I rated that high. I don't know. I think it is just it is such a commitment, Like, it's because it's not something that's like right on the top of my list. Looking at that like brick of a book and being like, I'll commit my time to this.
I think Wheel of Time was the first series that I ever started using the glossary for. Going through
Dune all day for me. That's why I never finished Dune. It was like I couldn't every page.
With Eye of the World, I would just go to words. I go to the back of the book. I'm like, okay, which ones are the red?
Yeah.
The red witches. Who's these people? Where are they from? And so like I usually never. I'm like, okay, glossary, get over yourself. But with Wheel of Time, like, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
So, Eye of the World is not the series I would like hand people just getting into the genre, but I think if they were like big fans of Lord of the Rings first, and if they had read Lord of the Rings, I think Eye of the World is an easier transition because it's very similar to Lord of the Rings when it starts out. It's almost like Lord of the Rings fan fiction in a lot of ways with Eye of the World.
Oh, you just made a lot of enemies right there.
I probably just made a lot of enemies.
I'm not going to cut that out either. You're going to have to live with what you just said.
I mean, the names are, the names and the roles are similar. It does much. Eye of the World was such an easier read for me than when I was reading Lord of the Rings, and I prefer reading the Wheel of Time series over the Lord of the Rings. But it is, if you're getting somebody who's new, who's like, I grew up watching fantasy movies or reading Harry Potter, it'd be hard to recommend Eye of the World right out of the gate, I think.
Are you a Robert?
Because it is just so much.
You a Robert Jordan fan, Nikki?
Yeah, I do like him. Yeah.
Have you read much of the Wheel of Time, or is that not your?
No, I haven't read a whole lot of it. No.
Okay.
I have a hard time getting into long series.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's fantasy, right? I mean, it's hard to find that standalone. Which
I always look at that before I start reading something.
Yeah.
That's probably
I mean, it's part of the reason why I picked up Elantris first when I did, because it was a standalone, and it was only you know what? Mistborn 1 was the first one that I picked up that was a part 1 of something. But it took me a while to read the second one. But I was in this kind of like weird stage of reading fantasy where I was reading Mistborn, Eye of the World, Game of Thrones, this Legend of the Five Rings series, and then I would go and read the sequels of those books. And I kind of got in this like weird. It took me a while to kind of get out of that. Like I gotta go read some other series for a bit.
Well, yeah, so. I mean, you're an old series reader way back to the Animorph days, so.
It
makes sense that you'd commit to that sort of thing. Kate is big into the Patricia Briggs, like Mercy Thompson series. Have anybody read those?
Listen, I was going to transition that because Kendra has been reading the Alpha and Omega series by Patricia Briggs.
Yeah.
And she started reading that because she was getting a little bit nostalgic for Twilight. And I think it's because you and I had been talking about there was this new Twilight book coming out, right? The Edward one.
Yeah.
And she was kind of looking like, she wants to read something that's like an adult Twilight, but not necessarily like the fantasy version of 50 Shades of Grey. And I think she seems really happy with what she found with Alpha and Omega. So like, and she says it's like clicked every box for her with being kind of like Twilight for adults.
Huh. Okay.
So I would, like we were talking about, if you had read Harry Potter and you're looking for something else, where would you go? I think, the same way, if you've been reading like Twilight or something, YA fantasy, then, there you go. I think Patricia Briggs has done a pretty good job with that. And like Kate, she's a big Patricia Briggs fan. She's read tons of the books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's waiting right there. Day of release, she's got it. I've only read we have a couple of the graphic novels in our collection, and I've read those and I liked them and had always intended to pick up that series, but again, I never have. So I guess so.
This book series I read, it's by Taran Matharu. It's called the Summoner series. I read The Novice, and it was 3 parts when I read it, and I think there's like a prequel and maybe like a standalone book. Basically, it's kind of like, Harry Potter meets Pokemon. So, if you really want to win over the reader in your life, I mean, it's basically they kind of go to the school and they become summoners, and they summon these kind of like benign, like demon creature things that, I mean, they really are just like infernal Pokemon. Like you have one, it's stronger, it listens to you. There's fighting, but they go to the school. And it's also kind of like high fantasy. When you look at the cover, I mean, it's this boy in a cloak with a bow and arrow, and then the second one is him in the woods and everything. So like package-wise, it looks very fun and fantastical. But I read it, and the only problem I had with it was that it was written a little bit younger than for me. But I think for the age it's going after, it like really
sounds like something my son would love.
Yeah, I think it was popular at the library that I ended up getting like second copies of all the books in the series, because I think it was really starting to find an audience and take off. Because I think, you just, if you say anything is like, it's this and Pokemon, you've kind of got a winning formula there. And I read The Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan, and he's gone on to write other stuff too, like The Brother Band and whatnot. Yeah. And that one was also, like, I could tell this is a kid's book. And I don't even think you would necessarily have to think of it as a YA kid's book. but it definitely is like a fantasy world that I think people can get into, that younger kids can get into. I mean, he wrote 12 of them and then started another one called Brother Band. It's a series that I wish had been around when I was a kid, because like reading it and looking at the titles and going through it, it's just like, man, I would have eaten this up as a kid. This is so cool that you're just
My son loves all those.
The Ranger's Apprentice.
Yeah, and he's a huge Harry Potter fan. That's what he went on to after he read the Potter series.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty smooth transition or alternative. And that series, reading it, I was like, I would have loved. Where were all these like cool
really
cool fantasy and sci-fi books when I was a kid? That's definitely, those two are definitely like the YA alternative I tend to think of.
To go a little younger than that, I think the Spiderwick Chronicles is a pretty solid series that I mean, it got a movie and stuff. People know about the Spiderwick Chronicles, but I sort of feel like it struggled in the shadows of both Harry Potter and like Lemony Snicket. I think that it never really quite like popped in the way that it could have. But that one's nice because there's 5. It's by Holly Black. 5 of the main series, and there's a three book set called Beyond the Spiderwick Chronicles. But they're all really manageable sizes. They're like 150 pages tops. And so...
Yeah, she went on to have a pretty good young adult career.
Yes, she did. But I think kids even younger, if you're talking about like that 8 to 10 range. But I feel like the Spiderwick Chronicles, though, are perfect for that emerging reader age.
I don't know how these hold up with kids. I had a book club. I did a book club with, I think they were 8th graders. And some of them read this as part of the book club. It was The Wizard of Earthsea, Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a book.
For the Harry Potter.
Yeah, it was a book I read after college. I just kind of like picked it up, mainly because I was working through the Hugos and Nebulas. And the 4th book, Tahanu, is one of the winners. So I was like, all right, I guess I got to read this series. I never read any of these. And like, I was kind of floored by Wizard of Earthsea. It was just so good and so realized in Earthsea, like after reading the first one, I'm like, I want to live in Earthsea, this like world, this archipelago fantasy world. It was just so unique and cool, and it didn't really win over the kids I had read, so it makes me think it's a little bit older.
It's got more of a Tolkien folk action to it,
but it doesn't feel like she's trying to emulate Lord of the Rings at all. It's so its own thing and so unique, and it's really like more meditative, I think.
Yeah.
Have you read all of those, Nikki?
Not all of them. No, I still have to finish. I started so many years ago when I read them. I think I have to restart the whole series. Not to sound fuzzy in my mind, but I think I've only read the first 2 a long time ago.
Yeah, I've read up to The Farthest Shore, so I need to finish Tahanu. But yeah, Wizard of Earthsea, it's one that like I feel like I would want to read to my kids.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's a book that you just have to read to your kids at this point.
Yeah.
The main character, he also starts very young and starts going to like wizard school, but he goes on, and the adventure it's different than.
It's got a lot of psychological and moral development.
Yeah.
Through, and it struggles with his identity and trusts it. But I
mean, Ursula K. Le Guin is a giant in both sci-fi and fantasy. So Wizard of Earthsea was one of those like, wow, why is it taking me so long? I must have been like 25 when I picked it up. I was like, wow, how did it take me so long to read this? But yeah, that was some good stuff. Yeah, maybe not necessarily like middle school age, because that's what I tried it with and that didn't hit on. But I like to see like what would happen if like a high schooler was reading it. But I definitely think if you're an adult looking for something, if you've never read Wizard of Earthsea, I think it has a lot to offer. Nick, you read Dragonfell. How do you feel about Dragonfell? That's a kid's book.
Yeah, Dragonfell by Sarah Prinius, we had on the show.
Yeah, we interviewed her about it.
We did. Yeah, we did. I had a good time with it. I thought it moved quickly. Reading wise, it went really quickly. It went in some directions that I didn't anticipate. And I felt like, especially, the age it's written for, because I think that's really even lower than a young adult, wouldn't you say? I mean, that's more of a
that definitely is a middle school fantasy book, maybe elementary school even.
I think it walked a really perfect line of being exciting and tense enough to keep a younger kid interested, but not too scary and not too heavy to turn them away. So I think that works really well for that age.
Yeah, that was a book that I also kind of felt like if I had found this like in 5th grade, I probably would have really liked it.
Yeah.
that kind of fantasy that I would have dug. And you're right, that kind of like level of like adventure meets fear in certain ways, and with a message. Yeah, a message about not being afraid of those who are different than you.
That's right. One I actually read as a child was one called the Spirit Flyer series by John Bybee. Have you guys ever heard of these?
No.
I had a friend who loved, the first one's called The Magic Bicycle. I had a friend who really loved these books, and I picked them up, and they just get progressively more weird. It's like it's like this kid is really obsessed with getting this special bike called a Spirit Flyer bike, and the more he like gets into getting that, there's this other faction who doesn't want them to have these Spirit Flyer bikes, and it just becomes like darker and weirder and twistier, and becomes a little bit more of like a religious allegory by the end. But I was totally into those books as a kid. Yeah. I loved them.
You know, I've said like my first urban fantasy was that steamy romance novel that I read.
Yeah, sure.
But really, before any of that, in 5th grade, I read The Witches, and like it's only involved doing this. I'm like, that is urban fantasy. I mean, it's about a boy
like
learning
that
there are
Roald
Dahl's witches. Yeah. It's about a boy learning from his grandmother that there are witches out there, and there's certain ways to take care of them, and it's dark, but I like ate it up as a kid. I think it was my favorite Roald Dahl book. You know, I like James and the Giant Peach and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, all that, but yeah. The Witches is the one that kind of like stuck with me the most. Like, this is cool. So
nice.
It's hard because then otherwise the only other big series is The Witcher, which is that I've read, and you know I've talked about that so many times now as I was reading it here on the podcast. But that would also, it's not necessarily, even if you've watched The Witcher, it's hard to like recommend the books because they're so weird, and the novels have such a weird structure that I could see people easily falling off of it. But
I enjoyed the graphic novels, the Witcher graphic novels. We have that huge hardbound collection of all of them, and I read everything in there, and I thought those were actually really good. So I would recommend those.
Nikki, what else is on your list?
I think you guys named like all my favorites, but I did have one that I was going to ask you guys about. It's comic book Moonstruck. I've been wanting to read those.
I've seen the Cher movie, Cher and Nicolas Cage, Moonstruck.
No,
different.
It's comic book. Yeah, it's immersed in a fantasy world. There's a queer romance, and I guess there's a lot of feminism in it. But it's supposed to be, for me, it seems like it would be a good transition from Harry Potter because it's not overly.
I'm looking at the I'm looking at the cover, and I'm unfamiliar with this. Came out in 2018.
As am I.
Yeah.
You stumped us, Nikki.
I have not checked. Yeah.
So, Nikki, how did you come across this one then?
I YouTube a lot in the morning when I'm taking a shower, and I just listen to reviews of stuff, and it was on someone's review.
Okay. You're not much of a graphic novel reader either, though, are you?
No, I read some, but not a lot. I've started out. I used to read the X-Men and Iron Man, 20 years ago. But.
Sure.
Nimona is a fantasy book by Noelle Stevenson, who went on to do the incredibly successful Lumberjanes series. Okay.
I've read.
I don't even know how there's no like Lumberjane show like on Netflix or Hulu or anything. It's just ripe for that. But Nimona is this fantasy book, and yeah, if you're talking about fantasy worlds that are definitely making sure they're inclusive, Nimona is this really interesting story about this girl who's also a dragon, and she's helping. It's been forever since I read this. She joins up with like this evil sorcerer who might not be so evil. It's just this. It's funny. It's interesting. It's very sad at times. It's a graphic novel, and it's definitely like an easy recommendation. It's standalone. It's really unique. It has kind of like a webcomic feel in a lot of ways, but it tells this really big story. That's a pretty good fantasy read. I enjoyed that one. And also graphic novel wise, I mean, she's big, so maybe I don't have to really sell this one. But if you're looking for like a lot of world building in a fantasy graphic novel like this, it's Monstrous by Marjorie Liu. She won the Hugo, I believe, multiple times for graphics. And reading this series, which is also at the library, it's like 3 or 4 volumes now. I read the first volume, and it's so much in there. It almost feels like you should be reading this as a novel, but the artwork is gorgeous. It's by Sana Takeda. It's such high fantasy. It's such this unique fantasy world that it is like a full meal of a fantasy read in this graphic novel. It's like it's not one that you can just pick up and you start just kind of like cruising through. If you're not paying attention to what you're reading about, you're gonna get lost a little bit later on. So I think it's been winning the Hugos for a reason. That's a pretty easy recommendation for fantasy and the graphic novels.
Yeah. So. All right. Well, let's end on a lightning round. Give me maybe your top 2 fantasy novels of all time, Nikki.
Oh.
I guess it would be Name of the Wind. I guess I have to say The Hobbit, just because I loved it.
Name of the Wind and The Hobbit. What about you, Eric? You got 2?
I get nostalgic. So the first ones that I read, like Elantris and Neverwhere and Name of the Wind, are like close to my heart because they were kind of the start of it all.
All right. Okay. Well.
And you, Nick?
Jeez. I mean, I don't...
All right, you only have to pick one.
I don't think that I really have an answer to that. I mean, I guess if we're talking like on a for like children, I would say the Wizard of Oz books really do deserve a second look because they're good and they have a lot going on. I guess for adults, can I say the Dresden Files? Does that count?
Yeah, you read it.
All right. Well, then, yeah. You think that's fantasy enough to count as like a fantasy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Then the Dresden Files.
And it's a 1-season show starring what's his name? Blackthorn?
Yeah, Paul Blackthorn. Yep, from
Arrow.
Yep, or ER. Mm-hmm. Depending on how old you are.
Yep.
Okay. Well, hey, Nikki, thanks so much for joining us for this. I know you were hoping for another 200 or so episodes before you had to do it, but let's transition into some library news. Nikki, are you excited about opening up at least a little bit?
Absolutely. Can't wait.
Are you going crazy being stuck at home?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
Yes, and I'm trying to think of excuses just to go to the grocery store.
Yeah. Yep. Oh well, you never know. You never know when you're going to need more. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, so just a reminder, everyone, we are going to be opening up for curbside service on June 29th. You're going to have some set pickup times throughout the day down at the auditorium entrance. So you can place your requests via email to wellsville@stls.org, by giving us a call, by placing them in StarCat. When that is up and running again, we'll keep you posted on that. And then just come down to the auditorium and check them out, whether it's books, movies, magazines, audiobooks, anything you want. We'll do it right there. The YA for Adult Book Club is currently reading Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor, which Kate and I are doing, so keep an eye out and read along with us on that. I don't know, anything else, Nikki, that you want to mention that's coming up? Summer reading program.
Yes, July 6th.
I've seen the bags. I have my summer reading program shirt.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go. Talk about the prizes a little bit, Nikki.
There's going to be a weekly prize, a $25 gift certificate from the Chamber, and a grand prize of a Nook tablet.
Nice. Pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Nook is how I read all my comics.
Yeah.
On my Nook tablet.
It is the way to go. I've had the same Nook tablet for many, many years now, and it's like a constant battle with me in this Nook tablet. I'm like, come on, buddy, just hold out a little bit longer. Because it's definitely showing its age. Yeah, but I mean, now that I have both the Marvel and the DC apps, I feel like I can never go back. Like I'm too spoiled by having the panel by panel option there. It's great. So,
everybody loves the panel by panel but me.
You don't like panel by panel?
I just read the whole page.
Wow. Okay.
I don't want to miss the splashes.
Sure. Okay. Understood. Well, usually if there's a big splash, it will give you the whole page, and then it will cut down too.
Yeah. Right. No, I don't know. Maybe I'm just stuck in my ways.
To each his own. You can read comics like a grandpa any way you want. That's just fine.
What?
All right. Well, once again, Nikki, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
My pleasure. That's going to do it for this week on the All the Book Show. We'll see you next time.